What is going on, Pooj crew? Thank you for being here for episode 134 of the Poojie Podcast. We'll dive into NFL Week 2 games on this episode. If you're a Jaguars fan looking for Jaguars content in a Jaguars versus Colts preview, please browse the channel and find that video elsewhere. If you're listening on a podcast streaming platform, that will be in a separate episode as well. I figured this was easiest. If you're a big NFL fan, you want to hear about all the games, this is the episode for you. If you are strictly a Jags fan and want more in-depth analysis of the Week 2 game versus the Indianapolis Colts, feel free to go find that video or podcast after you are done with this episode. I'll also link it to this video as well. So be on the lookout for that. But thank you for being here for this episode of the Poojie Podcast. Jam-packed episode for you today. It's going to be a fun one and a fast one, but I am doing things a little differently. Instead of going through each game and just giving you my thoughts and prediction, we're going to go through some topics for each game instead. And let's kick it off with the most exciting game of the week. This is always a hot topic around the NFL world. People are looking for the most exciting game of the week. And ironically enough, I think this week is bookended by the two most exciting games. The first game, Chargers at Chiefs, this is going to be a fireworks shootout, in my opinion. The Chiefs came out hot in week 1. There's nothing that suggests we should expect anything less from them. The Chargers also get the 5-point victory over the Raiders last week. And it's a divisional matchup, a Thursday night game. And these Thursday night games are typically bits of snoozers, snooze fest, including Jaguars at Jets later on in the season. However, this matchup is going to be a fun one. I won't go too in-depth into it, considering it's already Thursday, and by the time people are listening to this, it might have already passed. But this is one of my most exciting games, I think, Justin Herbert versus Patrick Mahomes. I'm curious to see how the Chargers respond after losing Keenan Allen. I know he's not playing tonight, especially on short rest, but the Chiefs, they looked very good last week, almost scoring at will against the Arizona Cardinals in that matchup. But the second most exciting game of the week is Vikings at Eagles. And if you think there's another matchup that's exciting, I get it. We will go through those later in the episode under different categories, but I do think this one's exciting for a few reasons. Granted, both these teams are 1-0. The Vikings scoring a huge victory over divisional rival the Green Bay Packers in week 1. The defense stepped up, held Aaron Rodgers to 7 points. Just a massive victory for the Vikings. And the Eagles escaped a comeback attempt by the Detroit Lions. 17-point lead erased late in the game. Ended up winning that one 38-35. I think this game is going to set the tone for both these teams moving forward into the season. Starting the season off 2-0 is always a big deal, and maybe the Eagles had a little bit of an easier time at doing that, playing the Lions and now the Falcons, rather than the Vikings playing, or Eagles playing the Lions and now the Vikings, and the Vikings playing the Packers and now the Eagles. I just think there's a lot of good things to watch in this game. The Eagles putting up 38 points in week 1. I don't think that was a fluke. I do think that offense is extremely dangerous, especially with the addition of A.J. Brown. We saw what the Eagles' game plan is going to be around A.J. Brown, and I don't think if the Eagles didn't have A.J. Brown, they would have been able to pull off that massive victory. Massive in terms of points scored last week. As far as the Vikings go, the defense was really the story of week 1. They held, like I said, Aaron Rodgers to 7 points. That defense is really going to have a hard time with this Eagles offense. I think this Eagles offense is better than the Packers offense, but the Vikings offense is going to have to do some work as well against an Eagles run defense that allowed a ton of yards and fantasy points, quite frankly, to DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams. I think the Vikings could get Dalvin Cook rolling. I think they could get Alexander Mattison going. And, oh, by the way, Justin Jefferson is still one of the top 3 wide receivers in the league, cementing that last week with that massive performance against the Lions. So this is an extremely exciting matchup of the week. Let's take a look at some of the worst games of the week. And realistically, the worst game of the week, in my opinion, is going to be the Falcons at the Rams. The Falcons last week had a victory and again blew a fourth quarter lead after a double-digit lead over the Saints. The Saints stormed back, won on a game-winning field goal by Will Lutz. And the Rams really struggled against the Bills. But then again, I do believe the Bills are the best team in the league. I'm not going to hold that loss too closely to the Rams. I do think that was more of the Bills just being a dominant team rather than the Rams being a terrible team. A 31-10 loss in the home opener versus the Bills was kind of embarrassing. However, I do think the Rams, this is a great bounce back spot for them. If they're looking at the schedule, they need this game. They need this game to get to 1-0. I really don't think there's anything too exciting about this matchup. I do think the Rams matchup all over the field is better than the Falcons at almost every position. Not almost every position. Yes, every position. Aaron Donald up front is going to feast on this Falcons offensive line. Marcus Mariota is not going to be able to control this game the way Matt Stafford is. I think the Rams do get the offense rolling a little bit better than they did against the Bills. I'm not going to be looking too closely at this matchup going into week 2 simply because I do think it's going to be such a bad game. But the best storylines of week 2, there's quite a few. I'm going to narrow it down to 3 storylines here for you, starting with the Bucs at the Saints. Now, this is an interesting one because the Bucs, a lot of people are calling them favorites to at least make the conference championship game in the NFC, to win the NFC South, excuse me. However, the Saints seem to have the Bucs number. In fact, the Saints are 7-1 against the Bucs in the last 8 games, and the Bucs only win came in the NFC divisional round of the playoffs 2 seasons ago. So in the regular season, the Bucs have not beaten the Saints in over 7 attempts. And I think the Saints do kind of have an equation, if you will, to beat the Bucs. The Bucs did come off a 19-3 victory last week over the Cowboys. Like I mentioned earlier, the Saints coming from behind to beat the Falcons. The Bucs defense is really what's going to win them this game, in my opinion. I think both offenses do have enough weapons to get the job done here, but I think the Bucs defense is just outstanding. I mean, what they did to the Cowboys offense last week cannot be forgotten. Holding the Cowboys to 3 points. Cowboys, the only team in week 1 to not score a touchdown. Pretty embarrassing if you ask me. And they lose Dak Prescott in that game as well. I do think the Saints here with Jameis Winston, who has a tendency to protect the ball. He was a guy that was just prone to throw 2 or 3 interceptions a game. But since his LASIK eye surgery, he has been a different quarterback. He's protected the ball well. But against the Bucs defense, that's going to be a tough task. But the storyline here is, will the Bucs be able to overcome the New Orleans Saints and really take a stronghold on that NFC South division moving forward into the season? This is a good opportunity for both teams to solidify their direction of the season. Dennis Allen versus Todd Bowles, 2 new head coaches on their teams. I do actually like the Saints in this one. I think the spread right now is plus 2.5. And let me preface all of this with this. Last week, the Ravens were the largest spread to cover. They opened at 4.5. They closed at 6.5. But you had teams like the Broncos lose straight up as 6.5 favorites. Bengals lose straight up as 6.5 point favorites. The Eagles as 6.5 point favorites win by 3. The Colts as 7.5 point favorites tie. I mean, the large spreads last week were dead in week 1. So I do project that trend to keep going. The NFL is just such a competitive league. It's pretty absurd. Saints 2.5, I think I would possibly lean that just because they are playing at home. And the Bucs really didn't have to do anything special last week either against the Cowboys. Better roster, better team, I agree. But I think with the history of this matchup, the Saints do kind of have some real estate in the Bucs' brain and in Tom Brady's brain. I mean, we'll never forget that 38-3, I think, Monday night loss by Tom Brady to the Saints in Tampa. So this is going to be a good one. Good storyline there. And then the Bears at the Packers as well. I'd have to take a look at this, but this might be the first time these teams have met in 20 years where the Bears had a better record than the Packers. Granted, it is only week 2, but the Bears getting the upset victory last week, another 6.5 point dog with the straight up win, 19-10 over the 49ers, albeit in pretty shitty weather. But the Packers just look lost. I mean, only putting up 7 points against the Vikings. They were never in that game to begin with. And the Bears are 5-24 against the Packers since the Aaron Rodgers era started back in 2008. Could this be an opportunity really for the Bears to let the Packers know their time as NFC North division leaders is done? If the Bears come out and win this game, the Packers will start 0-2. not only 0-2, but 0-2 in divisional games, which the Packers pride themselves on being able to win those divisional games and really take a stronghold on the division. And the Bears, again, last week's game was kind of wonky considering the weather, but I'd be curious to see how the team responds maybe in some better weather. You're playing in Green Bay, but it's not really November or December yet. You should be getting some favorable weather there. So I'm really excited for that game. And the last best storyline of the week is going to be Dolphins at Ravens with Lamar Jackson playing his hometown Dolphins. There's been rumors swirling all offseason about Lamar Jackson's contract and his extension, and will he be a Raven in the future? Will he go to the Dolphins if Tua's done? So I think that's a great storyline to watch here. The Dolphins coming off a massive Week 1 victory over the Patriots. The Ravens taking care of business against the Jets 24-9. So I'm excited for this one because I think both of these teams could solidify themselves as not only divisional contenders in their respective divisions, but definitely wild card teams coming out of the AFC. So Lamar Jackson versus the Dolphins is going to be a fun one to watch. My biggest question of the week heading into week 2 is going to be the Seahawks at the 49ers. I think both these games last week that these two teams had were just extremely weird. You had the Seahawks playing the Broncos, Russell Wilson's return to Seattle. Broncos fumbled twice on the goal line. Broncos very easily could have won that game by double digits, but got to give credit where it's due. Geno Smith stepped up for the Seahawks, got the job done. As much as the Broncos defense stepped up in the second half, the Seahawks defense was able to match that and hold strong against a Broncos team that was expected to win by 6+ points. Is that fact or fiction for the Seahawks? That's what's going to be decided this week. If the Seahawks come out and play strong against a 49ers team that is coming off a tough loss to the Bears, 19-10, the Seahawks, a lot of people, including myself, were considering the Seahawks as one of the worst, not only teams, but rosters in the NFL. And then on the same note, the 49ers playing in that weather last week in Chicago. Did we really get a good read on what the 49ers were going to be? So call this my fact or fiction game of the week. Which of these teams will step up and show us that last week was their true identity? Will the 49ers be able to bounce back and reveal to us what we all think, that they are going to be an NFC contender? Or will the Seahawks step up and show us what we all didn't think, that they are a true competitor in the league and not an easy win on the schedule for any team? Something's got to give. Something's got to give is our next game of the week. We have the Cardinals at the Raiders. Both these teams 0-1 going into week 2. That's not a huge hole to be in at the end of week 1. Typically, 16 teams have a loss. Not this year because there was a tie, but teams are going to be 0-1 after week 1. That's simply how it is. The Cardinals probably got their toughest game out of the way against the Chiefs, but they were playing at home and they looked terrible, losing by upwards of 20 points to a Chiefs team that had lost Tyreek Hill. This was an opportunity for the Cardinals really to step up and show the world what they were made of. Granted, they didn't have DeAndre Hopkins, but that's no excuse. They have Kyler Murray, who's touted as a top 10, top 5 quarterback in some eyes. They have James Conner, and they have plenty of weapons on the outside, including Marquise Brown, who came over from the Ravens. But then the Raiders lose a 5-point game to the Chargers, and similar to the Broncos versus the Seahawks, it felt like the Raiders were doing enough in that game to win. A few fumbles here and there, a few bad breaks didn't go their way. They end up losing that game. So this is my something's got to give game. One of these teams has to win unless, again, they pull a Colts-Texans and there's a tie. I don't imagine that happening. The Raiders are 6-point favorites, which I do think is a little bit high in this game. I do think the Cardinals respond well here, especially after the huge test they faced in week 1 against the Chiefs. But I do see this game as kind of being a coin flip, and I'm very curious to see which team responds best from their week 1 loss. Now, let's hit the snooze button. Every week has a game that we look at the schedule and we're just like, that game, I have zero interest in that game. And if it wasn't for these two fan bases, and if it wasn't for the history and tradition of these two teams, this would be a game that no one watches, gets no love in the national media. But because it's the Jets at the Browns, this is a game that people are going to talk about just because it's New York media market versus the Cleveland Brown history and tradition. But really, there's nothing exciting about this game. I mean, you have Joe Flacco going up against Jacoby Brissett. You have both these teams really not poor performances in week one by the Browns, but the Jets just stumbling against the Ravens, just trying to get to the end of the fourth quarter healthy. And you have the Browns with a but a massive 58-yard field goal by rookie Cade York to get the job done against Baker Mayfield and the Panthers. Was their steam and energy a little bit too high for that game? Will they have a letdown spot here against the Jets? They could. I could see that happening. Maybe this is an upset special here, but realistically, this game just has zero interest in my eyes. I'm not excited for this game. There's no storylines surrounding this game that really draw any intrigue to week 2, Jets at Browns. My NFL Red Zone game of the week. This is a game where if you're like my brother, like a lot of my friends that just sit there and are glued to NFL Red Zone for 8 straight hours from 1 p.m. to 9 p.m., or I guess 7 hours of commercial-free football is what Hansen says, considering Sunday Night Football kind of starts around 8. So 1 to 8, excuse me. My NFL Red Zone game of the week, this is a game that I think you're going to be seeing a lot of on NFL Red Zone, is the Commanders at the Lions. The Commanders putting up 28 points against the Jags last week, 2 touchdowns to start the game, 2 touchdowns to end the game, and a lot of shit in the middle of it that they did not look good at all. The Lions putting up 35 points last week against the Eagles, not enough to win. But I think both of these defenses are pretty terrible. Jaguars putting up 22 points against the Commanders, and realistically, it should have been upward of 30. The Jaguars were 2-5 in the red zone. I think the Lions are able to get the job done a little bit better here in this matchup. And as far as the Lions running game goes, you have DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams. They should be able to outproduce what James Robinson and Travis Etienne did last week. And then on the Commander side, you have Antonio Gibson, you have J.D. McKissick, you still have Terry McLaurin. Curtis Samuel played great in that game against Jacksonville. So I think that this game is the NFL Red Zone game of the week. I think you'll be seeing a lot of this on NFL Red Zone. A lot of touchdowns in this one, possibly another Lions game seeing over 70 points total. I might not go that far. I might go with like a 31-27 in this game, but it's going to be a high-scoring game nonetheless. My best matchup to watch in week 1, and again, when I say best matchup, I don't mean that in a fantasy sense where it's the best matchup of a player versus a team. I say this is the best matchup to watch with the most intrigue, and that one's going to be Derrick Henry versus the Bills' run defense. The Bills' run defense held the Rams to only 52 rushing yards. We saw Cam Akers not really play. Darrell Henderson couldn't get it going. And Derrick Henry, 82 yards in the week 1 opener against the Giants. We expected more from him, but he has a history of playing well against the Bills. I do think that going to Buffalo is going to be a tall task for the Titans. But after week 1 and the Titans trying to figure out their offense, maybe week 2 is where they decide to lean more so on Derrick Henry. I think he only had 14 carries in week 1. The backup running back in Tennessee was the storyline last week with Dontrell Hilliard with like 60 yards receiving and 2 touchdowns. But Derrick Henry versus the Bills run defense Monday night. I think this is the 7:15 game. This is going to be a fun matchup to watch between a stout run defense and a dominant running back in the league. So be on the lookout for this matchup. My worst matchup of the week is going to be the Patriots offense versus the Steelers defense. I mean, we all saw what the Steelers defense did last week. 7 sacks of Joe Burrow, 1 forced fumble, 1 interception, and 1 defensive touchdown against a Bengals team that has Super Bowl aspirations. The Steelers end up pulling out that victory 23-20 in overtime. Yes, they got help from Evan McPherson and the Cincinnati Bengals special teams not being able to get the job done at the end of regulation. But the Steelers defense is what kept them in the game every time the Bengals tried to push down the field and score touchdowns, held them to field goals, held them to missed field goals, turnovers, whatever it was. That Steelers defense without TJ Watt is going to be something to watch, but I still think overall that Steelers defense is going to step up big against the Patriots offense that really, really struggled against the Miami Dolphins in week 1. And granted, the New England Patriots do struggle with the Dolphins, it feels like every year, no matter where these two teams are in standings or skill. It does seem like the Patriots and the Dolphins always have great matchups. But I just think the Patriots offense is not doing anything for me. They have no weapons on the outside. Jacoby Myers, I think, was their leading receiver last week. The running back situation in New England, they didn't step up and have breakout games. And the Miami defense was able to hold the Patriots offense to just 7 points. So I look at this game and I think there is a total mismatch with the Steelers defense versus the Patriots offense. And the other game I'm going with the worst matchup of the week is going to be Cooper Kupp versus the Falcons. I mean, Cooper Kupp in week 1, his team scored 10 points. He had 13 catches, 128 yards, and a touchdown versus the Bills, accounting for the only touchdown of the game for the Rams. And he just showed how dominant he is as a receiver. Even when his team loses by 21 points, he still puts up stats. He still puts up fantasy numbers. And he's going against the Falcons defense that allowed 13 catches, 171 yards, and 2 touchdowns to Jarvis Landry and Michael Thomas combined last week. It was nice to see Michael Thomas break out in that game and help his team crawl back for the victory against the Saints. But I think Cooper Kupp and the Falcons, especially coming off an embarrassing home loss to the Bills, I think this is a spot where the Rams are able to just dominate this game. This was going to be my worst matchup of the week, but I wanted to hold it for this one right here with Cooper Kupp versus the Falcons as one of the worst fantasy matchups or one of the worst weekly matchups of the week. Look for Cooper Kupp to possibly match what Jarvis Landry and Michael Thomas did last week in this matchup. Week 1, saw a lot of upsets, saw a lot of bad decision-making, but let's look at who's on the hot seat after week 1 going into week 2, and it's got to start with the Bengals offensive line. I mean, if that Bengals offensive line does not get better, Joe Burrow is going to be in for a long season, and the Bengals are going to be in for a long season. And typically when you see struggles like that on the offensive line, they don't get better during the season. It's not like you got to wait for the team to get into form. It's not like you got to wait for chemistry to form either. This is an offensive line that's only returning one starter from 2021. I think this offensive line is on the hot seat. They have to step up for Joe Burrow's sake. Joe Burrow injured 2 seasons ago. There was a big question mark around the Jamar Chase draft pick versus Penei Sewell. They took Jamar Chase, which turned out to help lead them to the Super Bowl. But there's question marks around this offensive line and if Joe Burrow is going to stay healthy. Joe Burrow's success really depends on this offensive line that allowed 7 sacks last week against the Steelers. And I do think the pressure from the Steelers probably accounted for a few of the forced throws and interceptions of Joe Burrow, 4 interceptions last week. Next on the hot seat, Nathaniel Hackett, Russell Wilson, and just the Broncos in general. Nathaniel Hackett, terrible play calling in the second half, in the fourth quarter, taking the ball down towards the 50-yard line, getting to the 45, setting up a 4th and 5, could have had Russell Wilson go for the first down. Instead, wasted about 35 seconds, then called a timeout, settled for a 64-yard field goal that was missed by Brandon McManus, and the Broncos go down in week 1, 17-16. Just terrible play calling, bad decision-making by Nathaniel Hackett, and even on the goal line, too. Even in the red zone, he really struggled. Wasn't sure what he was doing there. I mean, first-time head coach, maybe that had something to do with it, not really knowing the typical play calls to make there. But Russell Wilson too, he's got to be a leader. He's got to make, audibles and decisions at the line that help set his team up for victory in better ways, because 4 red zone trips with 0 points by the Broncos last week, 2 running back fumbles in the red zone right at the goal line. I mean, the Broncos could have won that game, like I said earlier, by at least 10, if not more. But the Seahawks defense stepped up. Russell Wilson needs to show us more this week against the Texans. So they're on the hot seat in week 2, just the Broncos in general, as well as the Packers and Cardinals. These are 2 teams that have really high playoff hopes. Obviously, the Packers are always favorites in the NFC. They lose Devontae Adams. And the Cardinals, on the same note, another NFC contender that we've seen for the last 3 or 4 years. Both these teams with pretty embarrassing losses to their respective opponents in week 1. Packers losing to the Vikings, Cardinals losing to the Chiefs. I'd say the Cardinals loss was a little bit more justified considering what we know the Chiefs are. The Packers loss, they just look lost that entire game. No excuses for either team, really. The Cardinals defense should have stepped up more against the Chiefs. The Packers offense should have stepped up more against the Vikings, but that just did not happen. Both these teams, winnable games this week. Cardinals versus the Raiders, not favorited in that game, but very, very winnable game for them. And then, like I said, the Packers and Bears, I do kind of think the Bears have a shot in that matchup. So both these teams have to get a win here to kind of salvage the fan base for the season, to not start 0-2. And next on the hot seat is Trey Lance. Step up to the plate. Trey Lance, after Jimmy G led the 49ers to the NFC Championship game in 2021, Trey Lance announced the starters. Shitty weather in Chicago. I cannot overstate that enough. Terrible weather. I'm not going to put too much blame on Trey Lance. I get that it was a tough situation to be in. 47% completion percentage, 164 total yards. He's got to step up and bounce back in this game. Like that's simply what it comes down to. Against the Seahawks defense that did look really good, but they were not going up against a team that had a guy like Deebo Samuel. So Trey Lance has to step up in this game for I think 49ers fans to feel better about him. Like I said, the weather in Chicago, I don't want to hold that against him too much. I do think it's a bounce back game for Trey Lance, but he's kind of on a hot seat here just because 49ers fans are going to get restless with Trey Lance if he doesn't turn it around quickly for this team, knowing Jimmy G is on the sideline as well. And last on the hot seat, obviously, the Dallas Cowboys. The Cowboys losing Dak Prescott, only getting a field goal in week 1. The team looked terrible. The Bucs really had no challenge in that game from the Dallas Cowboys side of the ball. The Cowboys went from preseason NFC East favorites to NFC East bottom dwellers in the odds books. They went from, I think, minus 140 to plus 500. Hell, even the Giants and the Commanders have better odds to win the division than the Cowboys do. And now the Eagles kind of seem like they're in full control of the division with the Cowboys stumbling. Not really too much else to say about them being on the hot seat, considering the reason they're on the hot seat is because the quarterback's injured. And even, don't get me wrong, even when Dak Prescott wasn't injured, the Cowboys still looked like shit last week. Like, they looked terrible. They looked like they missed Amari Cooper. They couldn't get anything going. Is that more so how bad the Cowboys offense is, or is it more so how good the Buccaneers defense is? That is to be seen, but they are on the hot seat. Let's move on a little bit. What is Poojie buying? Poojie, besides buying some new golf clubs, is going to be buying the Chiefs are better than the past. They came out against the Cardinals. They won pretty handedly, would be an understatement of the year. They dominated the Cardinals. Patrick Mahomes just all over the place on the field, touchdowns left and right, no-look passes. Clyde Edwards-Helaire came back and looked great in that game. They didn't miss a beat without Tyreek Hill. That answered the question for me if they were going to miss Tyreek Hill, and they indeed did not. In fact, first touchdown was to Travis Kelce. In last week's episode, I said if all else fails, throw it to Travis Kelce. First touchdown score for the Chiefs last week. And I think that we're going to continue to see them rolling. Maybe the lack of Tyreek Hill helps the Chiefs open up the playbook a little more. Not having to force the ball into Tyreek Hill's hands might help Patrick Mahomes. And maybe the offense got stagnant and complacent. And maybe that's why Andy Reid's one of the best coaches. Maybe he could sense that the offense was getting a little stale and a little bit figured out by the rest of the NFL. But I do think the Chiefs are better than the past. Even without Tyreek Hill. That's what I'm buying. But what is Poojie selling this week? Poojie is selling that the Bengals are a shoo-in for the playoffs. I do not think the Bengals are going to have as easy of a time getting into the playoffs out of the AFC North as a lot of people thought they would in the preseason. Opening up week 1, losing 23-20 to the Steelers already puts them behind the 8 ball. But listen to these last 8 games, okay? Listen to these last 8 games they have starting on November 20th. They travel to Pittsburgh to face the Steelers. They travel to Tennessee to face the Titans. They have the Chiefs at home. They go to Tampa to play the Bucs. They have the Bills at home, and they have the Ravens at home. I mean, if you're looking at an 8-game stretch late in the season, the Bengals might have one of the toughest stretches of football to end the season after Thanksgiving. I mean, there's very little chance they get through that gauntlet 6-0 with those 6 games. They have 2 simple games, I think, sandwiched in there somewhere. But to come out of that stretch 3-3 is going to be 3-3 would be good for them. 4-2 would be ideal, but realistically, 2-4 or 3-3 in that stretch of 6 games is going to be what they're going to need. And if they don't get the ball rolling now in winning games that they should win, i.e. against the Steelers in week 1 at home, this Bengals team's going to struggle to make the playoffs. The Ravens look like contenders. The Steelers look like contenders. Hell, the whole AFC North is 1-0 right now, including the Browns. And the Bengals are sitting at the bottom of the division at 0-1. So I'm selling the Bengals as a shoe-in for the playoffs. I'm going to monitor that closely. If they're able to get through their next 6 games 6-0, maybe things change. But I just don't think we're going to see the dominant Bengals that we have in the past, especially if that offensive line does not step up. It's going to be a long season for the Bengals. Now, let's get to some fantasy news and notes for the week. Let's go through some fantasy stars of the week. I'll give you 1 quarterback, 1 running back, 1 wide receiver, 1 tight end that I believe is going to be a star this week. And let me preface it with this. I'm not going to pick players like Patrick Mahomes or Justin Jefferson or Travis Kelce, those guys that are going to be stars, it feels like, every week. But at the quarterback position, I'm going to go with Derek Carr versus the Cardinals. Derek Carr struggled a little bit against the Chargers in week 1, but there were a lot of mistakes made in that game by the Raiders on both sides of the ball. The Cardinals did just allow a ton of fantasy points to Patrick Mahomes. Granted, it was Patrick Mahomes, but allowed Mahomes to put up 35 points in week 1 as a fantasy quarterback. I do think Derek Carr does get the ball rolling on his 2022 campaign here against the Cardinals. Devontae Adams gets more involved. The offense looks better against a Cardinals team that couldn't stop a nosebleed last week. At the running back position, I made this episode script before I looked at some of the rankings, but I'm going to go with Saquon Barkley versus the Panthers. I know I just said I wasn't going to pick the obvious ones. I didn't think this was going to be such a hot topic, but it is. And maybe that's on me. Maybe I should have found a different running back to pick, but I'm going to go with Saquon Barkley in this one. If I did have to pick another one, maybe I go with DeAndre Swift versus Washington or Antonio Gibson versus Detroit, since I've already talked about them. But Saquon Barkley, 30 fantasy points in week 1 versus the Titans, and the Panthers allowed 36 total fantasy points to Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt last week. Kareem Hunt, I think, scoring twice in that one. So Saquon Barkley, fantasy star of week 2 against the Panthers. At the wide receiver position, again, I'm not going with obvious names here, but I am going to go with Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos versus the Houston Texans. I do think the Broncos are going to be a little pissed after last week's loss. Courtland Sutton had 7 targets, only 4 catches, and around 80 yards. But I do think this is a bounce-back game for Courtland Sutton, even Jerry Jeudy as well. I think the Broncos' passing attack does get underway in this one. And I think if last week was any indication of what the Texans team is, the first 3 quarters were fiction, and the fourth quarter was fact. In the fourth quarter, the Texans blew a 17-point lead. The Texans allowed 39 total fantasy points to Colts receivers in this one. And I do think the Broncos will have a little bit of an easier time against the Houston Texans in this matchup. And at the tight end position, I'm going to go with Zach Ertz at the Raiders. This is a tough one because in fantasy football at the tight end position, you're either elite or you're a streaming option, is what it feels like. Zach Ertz put up 10.5 points, 11 points last week against the Chiefs, which obviously isn't that great, but the Raiders did allow 14 points to Gerald Everett last week in the Chargers tight end. So I am going to go with Zach Ertz in this one. I think for the Cardinals to get the job done, they're going to have to rely on Zach Ertz a little bit here. He did only have 14 yards, but he did have a touchdown last week. I could see Zach Ertz getting more involved in this one. My other tight end star of the week was going to be Gerald Everett versus the Chiefs, but considering that's the Thursday night game, I wasn't going to include that one, but there it is for you. And fantasy duds of the week. That should say fantasy duds of the week, not fantasy duds of the game. I'm dumb. But fantasy duds of the week, a little bit of a surprising one here. I'm going to go with Lamar Jackson versus the Dolphins. Don't get me wrong, Lamar Jackson is a must start every week for the Ravens, but I don't think that we're going to see the numbers from him that we expect to see. He had a little bit of an easy matchup in week 1 versus the Jets. I don't think he really was battle tested at all. So was he really able to sharpen his skills in week one? He did have 3 touchdowns, only 213 yards. That's in large part attributed to a defense that was able to cause turnovers and create short fields for the Ravens, but only a 57% completion percentage as well by Lamar Jackson in week one. And the Dolphins only allowed 9.5 points to Mac Jones in week one and stymied that Patriots offense. So don't be surprised if the Dolphins step up in this one against Lamar Jackson. Mike McDaniels appears to know what he's doing there in Miami. So that's kind of one that I'm watching. Start Lamar Jackson in fantasy, but don't be surprised if he doesn't surpass, 18 to 20 fantasy points, maybe more so in the 14 to 16 range there. At the running back position, fantasy dud of the week is going to be Leonard Fournette at the New Orleans Saints. Really not much to say here. Leonard Fournette had a fantastic week one against the Dallas Cowboys. I think we all expect Leonard Fournette to feast every week, get a lot of the workload, take a lot of pressure off of Tom Brady and the passing game. And they lose Chris Godwin. Julio Jones is injured, but also Leonard Fournette popped up on the injury report in this one. On the Saints side of the ball, they did allow, they were the 14th best against the run last week. But I do think, like I said earlier in the storylines segment, I do think that the Saints defense will step up against a Bucs team that they've had success against in the past. I don't like Leonard Fournette this week for that reason. And I also don't necessarily think the game flow is going to be there for the Saints to allow them to use Leonard Fournette, for the Bucs to use Leonard Fournette. I think this is going to be kind of a battle between two passing games in this one with Jameis Winston versus Tom Brady. Bit of an obvious one here. I gave you an obvious one in Saquon Barkley and the Stars. I'll give you an obvious one in the fantasy duds. CeeDee Lamb versus the Bengals. Cooper Rush. Nothing else needs to be said. They lose Dak Prescott. CeeDee Lamb looked terrible in week one, even when Dak Prescott was in the game. He was touted to be the wide receiver 1 in Dallas, and that seems to be a little bit more fiction than fact of the Dallas Cowboys season. Enter Cooper Rush, enter a Dallas offense that was stagnant, in week one. Not too much to be excited for with CeeDee Lamb against the Bengals. The Bengals only allowed 17 points total to Steelers receivers last week. Yes, the Steelers won the game, but the offensive production from the Steelers was not that fantastic. So CeeDee Lamb, a dud of the week. And at the tight end position, Kyle Pitts at the LA Rams. Kyle Pitts in week one had a good showing, was able to put up numbers, probably helped your fantasy teams. That is what it is. But this is a Falcons team that is traveling all the way to the West Coast, facing off against a Rams team at home for the second straight week on 10 days rest, and a Rams team that allowed 1 point to Bills tight ends last week to Dawson Knox. So as much as the Bills dominated last week, winning 31-10, the Rams held the tight ends in check. Kyle Pitts, again, like Lamar Jackson, you're going to start him because he's considered a top 5 tight end. I just don't think we see a fantastic game out of Kyle Pitts like a lot of people are expecting. So there you have it. That's the week 2 news and notes. Obviously, no Jaguars Colts talk in this episode. If you're looking for that as a Jags fan, which I know there's some of you out there, some of the subscribers, some of the listeners, Jags fans, but I know there's a lot of NFL fans out there listening as well. So I did want to take you through a lot of the games of the week, and I think I hit on all the games. Let me take a look real quick, but I appreciate all of you listening to this episode, and not too much else needs to be said. We are going to learn more about these teams as the season unfolds. I look forward to doing this every week to give you guys an idea of where things stand in the NFL world and what to look for moving forward. So appreciate y'all being here. Quick video, subscribe and like, tell your friends, comment your thoughts, share your opinions, give me your fantasy stars and duds of the week, what you're buying and selling. Do all that in the comments, but I appreciate you most importantly for supporting the channel, being here to listen, and helping out the Poojie Podcast. Go enjoy the rest of your week, and it's already Thursday Night Football coming up, but enjoy some college football on Saturday to whet the appetite for a loaded Sunday edition of football with the NFL, and 2 games on Monday night. That'll be fun to watch as well. So thank you again for being here. Go enjoy the rest of your week, but most importantly, go make this world a better place and take